I still remember that day as if it happened yesterday. We were sitting under the old oak tree in the park, sharing a blanket and laughing about nothing in particular. It was the kind of laughter that felt light and endless, like we'd known each other forever. He'd just said something silly, something only he would say, and his laugh, warm, honest, just a little bit goofy, filled the air around us. I glanced at him and thought, this is it. This is the beginning of everything. We weren't much more than kids back then, really, but there was something about him, something different that I couldn't explain. His kindness drew people in. He had a way of making the whole world seem brighter just by being there. I was young, maybe a little naive, but he felt like everything I'd been waiting for, the kind of person who could fill all the spaces I hadn't even known were empty. Looking back, I realize I was swept up by the magic of it all, the way he seemed to understand me, the easy way we fit together, and that spark, which felt rare and powerful. It's easy to believe in forever when you're standing at the beginning, and with him, forever seemed so certain. We spent endless afternoons like that, wrapped in quiet moments and plans for the future. I thought I'd found someone who'd be there through it all. And in those early days, it seemed like he felt the same way too. Those early days felt like a dream, each moment somehow better than the last. We'd spend hours talking about anything and everything, losing track of time as the sun would sink into the horizon and streetlights blinked awake. Our conversations felt like their own little world, no judgments, no worries, just us, wrapped in the safety of understanding each other. He could make me laugh over the smallest things, silly jokes and little quirks that only we seemed to understand. It was like we had our own language, one made up of shared glances, quiet smiles, and inside jokes that would make us burst into laughter for no reason. Weekends became our time to explore. We'd take long drives to nowhere in particular, windows down, music blaring, his hand resting on mine as we sped along empty roads. Sometimes we'd pull over by a quiet lake or a grassy hill and just sit, talking about all the places we'd go together someday, all the things we'd see. He'd tell me stories about his childhood dreams, and I'd share my own hopes for the future. In those moments, I felt like we were creating a future together, one that stretched out in front of us, endless and perfect. Whenever I looked at him, I felt a deep certainty that this was it. He was the one, the person I could count on, the person who'd be by my side no matter what. He made everything feel so safe, so unbreakable. And maybe that's why I ignored the tiny signs, the small moments when his attention would drift, or he'd brush off something I said with a half-hearted smile. They felt so small, so easy to overlook in the warmth of everything we had. There were times he seemed a little distant, caught up in thoughts he wouldn't share. I'd ask if something was wrong, and he'd shake his head, assuring me it was nothing, pulling me close with a reassuring grin. And just like that, any little doubt would disappear, replaced by the warmth of his embrace and the belief that we were unbreakable. I was so sure we'd always stay like this, wrapped in each other's world, untouched by anything outside. Because when you're young and in love, it's so easy to believe that forever is a promise that's already been made. Over time, I began noticing small shifts in him, things that I'd once thought I knew so well. The way his laughter didn't come as easily, or how his eyes seemed to drift, caught in thoughts he wouldn't share. He was still there beside me, but it was like a part of him had started to slip away, hidden just out of reach. At first I brushed it off. Everyone goes through rough days, I told myself. I thought maybe he was stressed, or just had things on his mind that he hadn't yet put into words. So I did what I thought any loving partner would do. I gave him space, tried to make things easier, hoping that eventually he'd open up to me again. I held on to our good memories, convinced that whatever was bothering him would pass. But instead of fading, the distance grew. Small arguments started cropping up, usually over the smallest things, how we'd spend our weekends, a forgotten message, or a misunderstood tone. Each time he'd get defensive, his words sharper than before. I'd end up apologizing, even when I wasn't sure what I'd done wrong, just to keep the peace, just to bring back the person I missed. But every argument left me feeling a little more confused, a little more uncertain. He'd assure me, with a quiet sigh, that everything was fine, but something deep inside told me it wasn't. I wanted so badly to believe him, to hold on to the hope that we were still the same, but the warmth I once felt was slowly being replaced by a nagging worry I couldn't ignore. It was as though a wall had begun to rise between us, one I couldn't see but could feel growing brick by brick every time we drifted apart in silence. When I'd reach for his hand, it felt different, colder, as if his mind was somewhere else entirely. And even though he was physically there, it was like I was grasping at a memory, something fading even as I held on. I'd catch myself wondering, is it me? Have I done something wrong? The questions haunted me, but I didn't dare ask them aloud, afraid of what his answer might be. As the distance grew, so did my doubts. But love is a strange thing. It makes you hold on even tighter, hoping that somehow things will return to how they used to be. I clung to the good memories, to the promises we'd made, convincing myself that this was just a phase, that soon enough he'd be the same person I'd fallen for. But deep down, I felt the quiet truth settling in, as heavy as a stone in my chest. The man I loved was changing, slipping into someone I barely recognized, and I was left standing there, wondering if I'd lost him or if he'd lost himself. One evening, it all came to a head. We were sitting in the small cafe where we'd once shared so many happy moments, yet now the air between us felt heavy. He seemed distracted, his eyes fixed on his phone, barely acknowledging the words I was saying. I could feel my heart sinking, but I tried to brush it off. Still, something in me broke, and I finally asked, "Are we okay? Are you okay?" He looked up, visibly irritated, as if my question was an inconvenience. "I'm just busy," he replied, his voice cold. "I have a lot going on, and honestly, I don't have time to deal with your constant need for reassurance." The words stung, sharper than I expected. I sat there, stunned, trying to process his sudden outburst. It wasn't just his words, it was the way he said them, as if my feelings were a burden he no longer wanted to carry. I wanted to stand up for myself, to tell him how his distance was hurting me, but something stopped me. A small voice whispered that maybe, if I let it go, things would return to normal. Maybe I just needed to be more understanding. So I swallowed my pride, forcing a weak smile, telling myself that love sometimes meant making sacrifices. I just have to be patient, I thought. This is just a rough patch. But it didn't end there. The more I compromised, the more I found myself bending to fit his needs, his schedule, his dreams, while mine quietly faded into the background. I convinced myself that it was just a part of loving someone, of being supportive. But with each compromise, I felt myself shrinking, becoming a shadow of the person I used to be. My own dreams, the ones I had once shared so excitedly with him, seemed distant, almost forgotten. Every time I tried to bring up my feelings, he'd dismiss them, telling me I was overthinking, that I was too emotional. I started to believe him. I told myself that maybe I was asking for too much, expecting too much, and that if I just tried harder, if I was a little quieter, a little less demanding, everything would go back to how it used to be. But instead I felt trapped. My love for him, which once felt free and joyful, now felt heavy and binding. I was no longer staying because of the happiness he brought me, but out of a fear of letting go. I had become so wrapped up in the hope that he would return to being the person I fell in love with that I didn't realize how much I had started to lose myself. I wanted to believe in us, in the promises we'd made, but it was becoming harder to ignore the truth. I was holding on to someone who had already let go of me, and yet I stayed, clinging to a love that felt more like a cage than a source of comfort. One quiet evening, I found myself alone, lost in thought, replaying our recent conversations and moments in my mind. I had tried everything to make things work, bending over backward just to keep him happy, yet it felt like nothing was enough. As I sat there staring at the empty room, a sudden question crossed my mind. What am I holding on to? The answer hit me harder than I expected. I was holding on to memories, pieces of the person he once was. But that person wasn't here anymore. Somewhere along the way, he'd changed, and I was left clinging to a version of him that had long disappeared. I felt a wave of sadness, realizing I was fighting to keep a love that no longer existed in the way I remembered. I decided to talk to a close friend, hoping that maybe saying it all out loud would help clear the fog. As I poured out my thoughts and fears, she listened quietly, nodding with that understanding look that only a true friend can give. When I was done, she took my hand, and with a gentle honesty, she said, "You deserve someone who meets you halfway, someone who values you just as much as you value them." Her words settled into my heart, a truth I had been avoiding for too long. I could see it now, how he'd become so focused on his own world, his own ambitions, that my feelings had started to feel like an inconvenience to him. He was no longer the warm, caring person I'd fallen in love with. Instead, he had become distant, his love seeming conditional, like I had to earn it by being exactly who he wanted me to be. That realization stung, but it was also freeing. I could finally see how much of myself I'd sacrificed just to keep him close. I had let go of my own dreams, my own needs, and the things that once made me, me, in an effort to be the perfect partner he expected. But in doing so, I'd lost sight of my own worth. I sat there, letting these thoughts sink in, and it dawned on me that I wasn't really holding on to him anymore. I was holding on to the hope that he might change back, that he'd remember the promises we once made to each other. But that hope was no longer enough. I realized that in clinging to an old version of him, I was losing my own sense of self. At that moment, something inside me shifted. I knew I couldn't keep sacrificing my happiness for someone who wasn't willing to meet me halfway. It was as if a weight had lifted. For the first time in a long time, I could see things clearly. I deserved a love that made me feel valued, not one that left me questioning my own worth. And with that clarity, I knew a decision had to be made, one that was as painful as it was necessary. The next day, I woke up with a heaviness in my chest, but beneath it, a sense of quiet strength. I knew what I had to do, even though every part of me wished things could be different. I had given this love everything I had, and now it was time to let go. That evening, I called him and asked if we could meet. We ended up at the same cafe where we'd shared so many happy moments. But this time, the warmth of those memories felt distant, as if they belonged to another life. He sat across from me, scrolling through his phone, barely looking up. The person I once felt so close to now felt like a stranger. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and finally spoke. "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice soft but firm. He looked up, surprised, sensing something serious in my tone. For a moment I saw a flicker of the old him in his eyes, but I couldn't let that distract me now. I needed to say what had been building up inside me for so long. I've been holding on to this relationship, hoping things would go back to how they used to be, but I can't keep doing this, not to myself. My voice trembled, but I pushed forward. I miss the person you used to be, but I can't keep sacrificing my happiness for something that no longer feels real." He sat there, stunned, as if he hadn't realized how much his actions had been affecting me. For a brief moment, I thought he might say something, maybe even apologize or fight for us. But instead, he just nodded, his gaze shifting away, unable to meet my eyes. It hurt, more than I could have imagined, to see him so indifferent, to realize he wasn't willing to put in the effort to keep us together. There was a painful silence between us, one that held all the words left unsaid, all the promises that had been broken. And in that silence, I found my answer. I could finally see that this relationship had been over long before I'd admitted it to myself. It wasn't love anymore. It was a memory, one that I had been desperately clinging to. As I stood up to leave, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. I looked at him one last time, knowing this was the end of a chapter that had shaped me in so many ways. "Goodbye," I whispered, more to myself than to him, and walked out of the cafe, each step feeling a little lighter than the last. Walking away wasn't easy. It felt like tearing away a part of my heart. But I also knew that this was the first step toward finding myself again. I had loved deeply, and though it hadn't turned out the way I'd hoped, I was leaving with a new understanding of what I deserved. As I walked down the quiet street, the evening air cool against my skin, I felt a calmness settle within me. It was the end of something beautiful, but also the beginning of something new. My own journey, my own story, one that no longer depended on someone else's love. In the days that followed, I felt an emptiness that was hard to ignore. Walking away had been the right choice, but it didn't make the silence any less heavy. Every place, every song, every little thing seemed to carry a memory of him, echoing in moments I wished I could forget. But with each passing day, I began to feel a bit of the weight lifting, as if a cloud was slowly clearing from my heart. At first, I didn't know what to do with myself. My days had been so intertwined with him that finding my own rhythm felt foreign, almost uncomfortable. But I took it one day at a time, letting myself feel the sadness, letting the memories come and go without holding on to them too tightly. I realized that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about making peace with it, about finding a way to move forward without letting it define me. I started doing small things just for myself, things I'd put aside in the effort to keep him happy. I picked up old hobbies, spent more time with friends, and rediscovered parts of myself that I hadn't realized I'd lost. Little by little, I felt pieces of myself returning, filling the spaces where sadness once lingered. I was beginning to see that this journey was as much about finding myself as it was about letting go of him. One afternoon, while walking in the park, I paused to watch a group of children laughing and playing. Their joy was simple, pure, unburdened by the complexities of love and loss. And in that moment, I felt a lightness that I hadn't felt in a long time. I realized that love didn't have to come from someone else to be fulfilling. I could find it in the world around me, in the people who truly cared, and most importantly, within myself. I began to understand that every ending is also a beginning. Losing him had given me the chance to find myself again, to remember that my happiness didn't depend on anyone else. I was learning to love myself in a way I hadn't before, with kindness, patience, and forgiveness. It was a slow process, but each step felt like a small victory, a reminder that I was stronger than I'd thought. As the seasons changed, so did I. The pain began to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. I no longer felt the need to look back or wonder about what could have been. Instead, I felt grateful for the love we'd shared, for the lessons I'd learned, and for the chance to grow. I was finally ready to let go of the past and embrace the future, whatever it might hold. Because in the end, letting go wasn't just about losing him. It was about finding myself, about stepping into a new chapter with a heart that was both wiser and open to the possibilities ahead. Months passed, and with each day, I felt more like myself again. The pain had softened, no longer a constant ache, but a gentle reminder of how far I'd come. Looking back, I realized that every part of this journey, every tear, every lonely night, every quiet victory, had shaped me into someone stronger, someone who could stand alone and feel whole. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the sun set, a warm sense of gratitude washed over me. I thought about the girl I had been, so eager to please, so afraid of losing someone else that she forgot how to hold on to herself. And then, I thought about the person I'd become. Someone who now understood that love should lift you up, not weigh you down. I'd learned that it's okay to walk away from what no longer brings you peace, that letting go doesn't mean giving up. It means choosing yourself, valuing your happiness, and embracing the freedom to grow. In losing him, I had found something far more precious: my own self-worth, my own voice, and a love for myself that no one else could take away. I no longer held on to the memories with sadness or regret. Instead, they felt like old photographs, pieces of a past that had its place and time, but no longer defined me. I'd loved deeply, and I had no shame in that. In fact, I was grateful, because that love had taught me the beauty of vulnerability, the strength it takes to heal, and the courage to start anew. As I looked toward the future, I felt a sense of excitement that I hadn't felt in a long time. I knew that life had more in store for me, new memories to create, new people to meet, and perhaps someday a new love that would meet me as an equal. But for now, I was at peace, content in knowing that I was enough just as I was. I'd once thought that love was about holding on, but now I knew that true love, the kind that matters most, was about learning when to let go, trusting that something better was waiting on the other side. And with that thought, I smiled, closing one chapter and embracing the beautiful unknown that lay ahead. Looking back on this journey, I see it as more than just a story of love and loss. It was a path to discovering myself, to understanding that real love doesn't demand you to shrink or sacrifice your happiness. My first love taught me what I deserve, what I need, and what true partnership should look like. I learned that boundaries are not walls, but doors that open to respect, mutual growth, and balance. There's a special kind of bittersweetness in a first love. It shapes you, fills you with dreams, and sometimes leaves you with lessons that stay with you forever. And though we went our separate ways, I carry forward the good moments and the strength that emerged from the hard ones. Now, I step into the future with hope, a hope that one day I'll find a love that fits my heart without asking me to change who I am. So, to anyone who has been through a similar experience or is struggling to let go, remember this: choosing yourself is not selfish, it's a gift. Letting go doesn't mean erasing the past, but it does mean creating space for a better future. Have you ever had to let go of someone you loved deeply to find yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories and insights. And if this journey resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe for more content that dives into life's deeper, often challenging moments. Your story matters, so let's share and grow together.